and welcome to True Crime with Emma Kenny, or the Kenny Crime Cult, which people are starting to say I'm actually running. So that's news to me, but nonetheless, if you want to be a member, you can join by subbing. Remember, I give out content every single Sunday, sometimes in between, but every Sunday there will be a new doc that I release, so make sure that you tune in then. Today I'm going to be talking about a case that's got kind of a few names, but I know it as the guy who named himself the Fox. He basically carried out the Wedding Day Massacre. You might not have heard of this, but it's still considered the worst crime the area that it happened in has ever seen. And also, just to make it clear that people didn't give him the name the Fox. Arthur Hutchinson gave himself the name the Fox. He liked the drama. He wanted to be infamous. He was just one of those kind of human beings. And I'm not gonna lie, it's a pretty gory story. But let's just take a look initially at who he was, where he came from, and I guess how he ended up doing some pretty terrifying crimes. So Arthur Hutchinson was born on the 19th of February 1941, a place called Hutton Henry. It's basically an area of the UK called Hartlepool, which is in County Durham. He's raised in Oughton Manor on the outskirts of Hartlepool, and he grew up in poverty. Hutchinson was an illegitimate child. He was the son of Louise Reardon, and Louise was married to a man called Cuthbert who had 4 children with her, but he was a child that was illegitimate within the family. In fact, Louise had 2 other children with their lodger. His mother was actually quoted as saying that, "I had 5 girls and they made my life hell for Arthur. They called him a bastard," which was true. So you can already see that, one, he comes from quite lowly beginnings. Secondly, there's quite a level of dysfunction in his family. Also, it's not great to have siblings that bully you, particularly when there's a distinction between the heritage you have and they have. Think about families. You all know how complex they can be. That's why we say that we choose our family when we have our friends, because we actually get to hang out with people that we like, as opposed to just being blood related to people that often we don't. But when that dysfunction occurs, it's hard. It's really hard growing up. So I'm going to say that Arthur Hutchinson's beginnings were problematic. That said, also has to be noted that he had an incredibly close relationship with his mother right until the end. So it's important to note that, because whereas we might be looking at abandonment and attachment issues, and certainly there is an abandonment factor in the fact that his father wasn't present, his biological one, he still had a stepdad, and he definitely had a good relationship with his mother. So we cannot credit him with having a wholly problematic upbringing. In fact, we could arguably say that maybe the fact that he had such a close relationship with his mother was down to the fact that she felt guilty for his heritage. So maybe that addresses the balance, so to speak, and makes Arthur Hutchinson have less of an excuse to growing into the demon of a human being that he became. And believe me, this man became a demon, in my opinion. Of course, I know that he's not literally a demon, although some may argue that people seem to be possessed by them at times, but I'm saying that certainly the way that he acted is definitely on the same level as the horror movies that you watch, where people are indeed possessed by demons. I think Amityville Horror, for example, those kind of things that play out, that's the kind of crime that this guy is responsible for. Now, one of the notable incidents in his childhood that we must mention is that his mother said that when he was a child, he had a really serious accident and he suffered as a small boy. He had a bad head injury and he was in a coma for 3 days after riding a bike into a lamppost. It left him with a fractured skull, and she said it totally transformed his personality. He went from being a loving child to being a really violent child, a distinct streak in his personality where he was violent, and it was something that she really noticed. And just to put this in context, he stabbed a sister of his when he was 7. He got scissors and stabbed her. I mean, that's not a low-grade attack. You know, picking up scissors and actually stabbing somebody with them means that there was a potential to kill that person. And this kid's 7. Most people are playing with Lego, riding bikes, just chilling with their friends and having fun. Who knows, playing computer games these days, for the last 12 months at least. You don't automatically assume that a child is going to do anything that could cause such serious harm. Now, to bring in the fact that this does happen at times, let me tell you about the fact that in China, a girl was charged with cutting her friend's head off at 11. She was 11. She was jealous of her friend. They hung out, and then she cut her head off. That actually happened. Look it up. I'll find a link actually and put it below. You know what happened there? You can't be held accountable in China until you're over 12. So her parents just had to pay the parents of the kid that she decapitated a fine. So we also accept that there are different levels of responsibility where children are concerned. I'm sure he wasn't actually actively thinking that he wanted to murder his sister, but what we do see is some real problematic impulse control even at 7 years of age. Having said that, 7-year-olds will often throw things across rooms, scream and shout, and be quite aggressive when they're not intentionally trying to be violent, they're just dealing with levels of frustration. So again, even though he'd had this injury and there was a marked change in his personality, it does seem that we could, even at this point, say he was just having a really bad day and made an impulse decision, stabbed his sister, and wasn't really thinking about consequences. But nonetheless, I've worked with a lot of kids. None of them have stabbed their sister at 7. Now, I don't know whether he had a relationship with his father, and I've done quite a lot of digging, and there doesn't really seem to be that much evidence that he was present at all in his life. But Cuthbert, his stepdad, was around, and even though his mother had a relationship with the lodger, and obviously it wouldn't have been a very traditional relationship, because divorce was so taboo, it did mean that Cuthbert stayed in his life. So he was raised by a man that he knew wasn't actually his father, and that probably would have altered the type of relationship that they had. Having said that, my own husband is a stepfather, and he's a brilliant dad. He's definitely benefited my children, so he may have had a great time with him. Who knows? We do see that Hutchinson starts to commit crimes early, and that's a big indicator here, because we've got this marked change in his personality, this violent streak developing, and then we've got criminal behaviour, and this begins at, wait for this, 11 years of age. And it's not a small crime. You know, this isn't, went to Tesco and took a Mars bar. It's not a crime where it's criminal damage. Again, a more common crime for young people. They act out in certain ways and cause themselves problems and have some kind of recourse with the courts. But this is serious. He's charged at 11 with indecent assault. So we're looking at sexual crime at 11 years of age. Now, over the next 7 years, he was in court another 19 times. And 4 of those times, it was because he was having sex with girls under the age of 16. So we are really seeing an escalation in sexually deviant behaviour. And at 22, so that's the early 1960s at this point, he actually is sent to prison for having been convicted of having sex with an underage girl. So he's known to the authorities. And he's also a repeating offender. And when you get this repeating cycle, you know that unless there is some really clear intervention, and I'm not just talking about prison, because prison I always think is more of a holding place. It's not a changing place. For somebody to really move through sex crimes, they have to have a real opportunity for therapy and a foundation that kind of cradles them through their understanding so that they don't reoffend. And then when they come out of prison, there should be a clear license so that they are constantly checked so that they're not engaging in acts that are inappropriate. And this kind of repetition and behaviour in crimes is going to show that there's a likelihood for a severe escalation. Now, another big and telling incident in Arthur Hutchinson's life is when he lands a 5.5-year prison sentence. And you want to know why? Because he was not paying rent to his brother. Dino, his half-brother, was renting to him a property, and he just didn't pay. So in the end, that really annoyed Dino. There was an altercation, and when they met, Arthur Hutchinson just thought, I'll resolve this by shooting him. So that's exactly what he does. He attempts to kill his brother by shooting him. That's what he does. He doesn't actually manage to do it successfully, but obviously the authorities, rightfully so, challenged this and put him away. I guess that Dino did manage to resolve the rent issue in the fact that he wasn't going to be there for 5.5 years, which kind of solved the problem. But nonetheless, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a dangerous individual with an escalation in these criminal behaviours, and also a willingness to have such low impulse control that he's willing to stab a sister and shoot a brother. That's a dangerous person. We don't need to go any further with that, do we? And you ask yourself, think of all these crimes he's been committing. 19 court appearances, lots of those for sexual offences, and grievous bodily harm. All of these things are telling us that we have a real problem person. And you have to ask yourself, why wasn't he given a harsher sentence? And why wasn't he given more direct control over what he could do when he was released from those particular sentences? In spite of the fact that he's obviously an individual that you would wish to avoid, he did manage to get married. In fact, he got married twice. He was actually violent in both of the marriages. He was married to Margaret and Hannah-Law. Hannah-Law said that she actually witnessed that Arthur Hutchinson had knocked his own mother off her rocking chair across the room. So he wasn't just violent to his wives. He wasn't just abusive to the women that he was meant to protect and love. He was also abusive to his own mother. And both of them, the people that are meant to be able to trust him, the people who'd married him, who loved him, both said he was very sexually violent. So again, he has no boundaries. And if you think about serial killers and murderers that you'll hear about, the big names, the Bundys and so on, very often they do have relatively non-violent relationships with their partners, and often quite good relationships with family members, even if they're dysfunctional. So we also know that Arthur Hutchinson breaks down those boundaries. He just doesn't care who he's violent to, even the mother who always protected him. I have 2 children. If either one of them raised a hand to me, I would be absolutely beyond shocked. It's just not my child's nature to do that. And if they did, I'd be highly disturbed and deeply worried for my own safety. But it's also really worth noting that Arthur Hutchinson's mum was loyal to him all the way to the end. She believed he was innocent. In spite of him stabbing his sister, in spite of him going to shoot his half-brother, in spite of all these offences that he was constantly in court for, she fully believed in him. Isn't it amazing what love can do when they say that you're blind to it? And it isn't uncommon. It isn't uncommon when a parent just cannot wrap their head around the fact that the child that they love could do anything heinous to anyone else, even when the evidence is clearly there. She was one of those people who just fully stood by him. That self-delusion, it can't be my son. Oh, my son's capable of this, stabbing his sister, trying to shoot his half-brother, but there's a limit to how far he'd go. You see, that's the way that people get stuck in really terribly coercive and domestically controlled relationships, because people always believe that this individual who acts out in horrible ways still has a boundary. It's why there are 3 domestic to 5 domestic homicides every single week in the UK. It'll be similar in the States, similar in most countries. It's because people stay believing that even though they get beaten up, they get sexually assaulted, they get abused, they get controlled, that their partner still has a boundary. And I guess that Arthur Hutchinson's mum, in spite of being thrown across the room by him, in spite of him being violent to her, in spite of her having this rap sheet that was huge on him, that still she believed that he had a point. You know, that there was a place he wouldn't go. And because of that, she trusted it. She trusted him. It's really sad. It's really sad for somebody who stoically and loyally stood by his side. Can't imagine what a shock that would have been when she realised that the crimes I'm going to talk about soon were committed by him. The only other person in his family that was known to be close to Arthur Hutchinson was his half-brother Dino, and he did try to straighten him out along the way and obviously got nearly murdered for doing so. So it wasn't that people didn't love him or make an effort with him. It was just that Hutchinson, to some degree, and I think as we go on and we look at his crimes, was not somebody who was safe to be on our streets from a very early age, and was a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode. As a child, those who knew him recollect that he was a real bully. He was constantly assaulting younger kids. He was just that nasty piece of work. He was an individual that you were not safe to be around, whether you were male and he bullied you or female and he assaulted you. He was one of those human beings that came with a warning. When Hutchinson got married for the first time, it was to a neighbour, Margaret Dover, and she was actually pregnant with his child. And he was a serial adulterer. He would constantly brag about his conquests with other women because, bizarrely enough, in spite of his history and in spite of his nature, he seemed to be strangely attractive to people. Like, women were happy to sleep with him, and it was something that he enjoyed. He was incredibly violent throughout his marriages. He suffered mood swings, and there were mood swings that seemed to have very little triggering them. It was the slightest provocation could just make him really rage. That marriage lasted for 3 years. They separated. And then throughout the early 60s, he was actually in prison. So he had sex with an underage girl. Then when he gets out of prison, he meets his second wife, Hannah Law, at a Christmas party in 1968. Now, again, they get together very quickly. They're married very quickly, but plays out in exactly the same way. He's violent, sexually assaults her, and just sleeps around. So he is perfect husband material, the kind of guy that you really want to be around. Now, I've tried to go quite deep on this to look about what he was doing in the 1970s, because there's a period of time that are pretty poorly documented. Around 1970, he kind of goes quiet. It is known that from 1970 onwards, he is convicted of sexual assaults. We also know he spends 5 years in prison for firearms offences and for attempting to shoot dead his half-brother Dino. And when he's been released from that sentence, again is back in custody. He gets done for theft, burglary, and he also gets charged with a brutal rape. It's 1983 by this point, but even though we don't know a lot about his whereabouts, what he was doing outside of prison, we do know that he was constantly offending. And he is offending in a big way. I'm not sure why he was even outside of prison, but nonetheless, these were all going on. The rape that I've just talked about, he didn't actually stand trial for, because on September the 23rd, 1983, he's at Selby Magistrates Court in North Yorkshire. He's obviously there to appear in front of the magistrate because he's had these offences that he's charged with, but he's not up for it. So even though he's meant to be in a place where he's being controlled and where he's going to be incarcerated correctly, and remember, this is a brutal rape, so hopefully for a long time, he's cunning. He's got this plan. So whilst he's there, he says, I need a loo. I want to go to the toilet. Now, I don't know why this would happen without somebody supervising, but they remove his handcuffs to do so. So they literally decuff this very dangerous criminal. And it's really important to note this because of what happens afterwards. So there he is, in court, completely contained, can't do any damage. He's being tried and is likely going to go away for a long period of time. And he knows this. So he manages to convince them to take his handcuffs off, and then he just runs upstairs, enters court one, which is basically having some refurbishment that day, runs past a decorator who recalls being completely stunned that there's this guy just steaming through his decorating and wondering what on earth is happening. He gets onto the press bench, dives head first through a window. I mean, with respect, we already know he's got a head injury, so that's not going to do any more good, is it? He cuts his knee really badly because he lands on the glass when he lands on the floor, and he also lands on a barbed wire fence below. But that's not enough to stop him. He's not like, oh my God, I'm injured. I probably need to have some attention immediately. This guy's going. He's going to escape. And again, that shows you the lengths that he'll go to act in a way according to his own rules. So he does get his way free from the barbed wire, and he gets to manage to lose himself in the crowds of Selby. And at this point, he's on the run. And we have an incredibly dangerous offender who likely knows that his time free is limited. What's going on through his mind? Because if you know, as a serial offender and as somebody who has really deviant sexual desires, that your time's limited, are you going to be thinking about hiding, or are you going to be thinking about offending? Because you know that the time you have left is limited. For me, that's going to escalate the level of crime that he's willing to commit. If he feels his days are numbered, then he's going to think that opportunity to do harm is numbered, and he enjoys it. So they haven't just lost an offender, they've lost a darkly dangerous, deviant offender. And him being on the run puts everybody's life at risk in that area. Hutchinson really badly gashed his knee on the barbed wire and the glass, and it did bleed a lot. And he actually got lost in the crowds at Selby, but then he did appear at Doncaster Casualty Department, where he was given an anti-tetanus injection and was dressed with a bandage. I mean, the irony that this guy throws himself out of a window, lands on a barbed wire fence, and then goes and uses a public service, to get himself sorted out. That would not happen today because hospitals would be alerted. But you can see how systems didn't work in the way that they work now. So he actually got his wounds tended to. It just shows you, doesn't it, the arrogance of the guy. I've just literally ran away from court on serious charges, and now I'm being looked after by the NHS. We know that he stayed in the Doncaster area sleeping rough. Sometimes he would stay at a small hotel. It was called the Morley Guest House, and it was in Morley Road. That's literally half a mile from where he was treated at hospital. We know that he did break into houses, and he was stealing credit cards, bank cards, cash, anything that could help him get by. Also, when he was on the run, he had access to a tape recorder, and he would tape his feelings. So there are actual copies of him talking about the crimes that he committed, and they're full of arrogance. They're all about why he's better than the police and how they can't catch him and so on and so forth. So you're invited into this character where he's just a guy who enjoys notoriety. He obviously feeds off that buzz that he has, both from all the nasty crimes that he commits, but also from feeling that he's one up on the authorities. There is anecdotal evidence that Hutchinson carried out quite a lot of burglaries whilst he was on the run, because there were lots of them reported around the Barnsley area, which is quite close to where he would have been, and he was kind of moving within a 15-mile radius, which is travelling from Doncaster to Sheffield and Barnsley. So it could be that he did quite a lot more burglaries than we would be aware of, and certainly his MO seems to be that type.
Hello, this is Hutchinson.
Hutchinson?
Yeah, the one that don't speak on one hot floor. Tell you what, I've never left the area from Selby, right? I've never left the area from Selby. I've been here all this time. I've this place called Warsaw, I don't even know where it is. The only time I've seen was on the new, I'm living rough, like the police have said, the new one's living rough, that's what I'm doing, living rough. Yeah. Stealing out people's back gardens, cabbages and things like that. That's how I'm living. I sleep by day and I travel at night. Are they still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah.
So what that's doing? That must be, you know who I am, don't you?
Sorry, mate, I can't understand.
I'm charged with burglary.
Yeah.
Right, so you know who I am, don't you? I'm not a hoax.
No, right.
So I'm not going to give myself up.
So now we know that Arthur Hutchinson is on the run. He's got access to money because he's burglaring other people's houses, and we also know that he's very, very dangerous. And it feels like the elements collide for this tragedy that I'm going to talk about, because this is a really horrific set of murders. It really is. But it's made even more distressing within the context that it happened. So the victims were throwing a wedding. The Leitner family were a really prominent group of Jewish community members in Sheffield. They were a very well-respected Jewish family, very well thought of by their friends, their colleagues, their extended family members. The father was Basil Leitner. He's 59 years old, so a young guy. He was a senior partner in the firm of solicitors in Sheffield's Leitner & Co. Mother was Avril Leitner. She was 55, and she was a paediatric psychologist for Sheffield City Council. So people of really good standing. The bride was Suzanne Leitner, and her brother, 28-year-old Richard Leitner, was a London-based barrister. And there was also a sister, Nicola Joy, who was 18. She was the baby in the family, and she was a student at Richmond College, Sheffield. Bridegroom was Ivor Wolfe, a Glasgow-based optician. So they were a power couple getting married with power parents. You know, this was a well-to-do family. They were successful, they were happy, they were close, and they were celebrating a really, really important occasion. And if you've ever been to a Jewish wedding, you will know that they are big affairs, really celebratory affairs, lots and lots of fun, and certainly this would have fell into that category. And they lived in a house that was big enough to actually house a marquee so that the wedding outside could be played out in their garden. So that gives you an insight into how well these people were doing. Lots of people had come over from Canada because the bridegroom's family were based in Canada, and they'd all travelled to Sheffield for the wedding. So we're talking about this incredible party. And just think about that. Think about how you feel before you go to a wedding of somebody close, or maybe your own wedding. It's just such a special day. People are laughing and drinking and having fun and dancing, and there's so much celebration. And you're thinking about new beginnings. You're thinking about hope, possibilities, potential, all those things that go hand in hand with people starting a new life together. And that's exactly how everyone was acting that day. The wedding took place on a Sunday. They had been at Sheffield Synagogue to obviously commit to the wedding. And then this extensive marquee is in the back of the garden, which is attached to the family home in Dore. There are guests from everywhere, as I said, from Canada, about 200 guests at the wedding. In all, there were around 200 guests at the wedding, and that meant that more than 300 people were either at or associated with the wedding, so caterers, photographers, neighbours and friends. And that meant that all of those needed to be interviewed and identified because of what happened next. So the police had a big job on their hands when we come to discussing how this murder investigation was investigated, because so many people were potentially the perpetrator. Before I tell you about the murders themselves, I may as well tell you that the reason that they were found, the bodies were actually found, is because the marquee company had to come and take it down. On Monday the 24th of October, just after 10 a.m, the team arrived to take down and remove the marquee. And they're really surprised because they've arranged it and it feels like no one's around. But they do actually have access to the marquee, so they go in. And that's when they see the first victim that they come across. Now she's alive. Nicola, the 18-year-old daughter, is alive, but she's handcuffed in a state of undress to one of the main tent poles. She's absolutely distraught, and she's also covered in blood. Her feet particularly are covered in blood. At this point, obviously, the police are called. So the Woodseat Subdivision Police go there after a 999 call, and the officers recall that what they are greeted by is one of the most gruesome sights that they ever have or were likely to experience. And for those of you with a disposition that doesn't want to know about gore, it's probably best to skip the next bit just to find out what happened to him in the end, because it's really gruesome. One of the ways that Hutchinson scoped out the homes that he wished to burgle was he'd actually sleep rough in the vicinity, and he'd watch, so he'd keep checks on the places that he wanted to break into. He'd keep himself out of sight. He'd often kind of be an undergrowth, really scary character. Like, that's straight out of a horror movie, isn't it? This guy's like in the undergrowth, looking and scoping out where he's going to strike next. He's obviously noticed this huge marquee. He knows there's a wedding on. And it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out that that means there's probably going to be food, there's going to be alcohol there, there's going to be leftovers. And we know he's short of money, so initially it could be that he just thinks, I'm going to be able to go into that marquee and I'm going to be able to eat and drink and fill myself up and then get myself out of there. And also a lot of times when people have had a wedding, they have presents in the place. You know, there are wedding gifts that don't get moved or opened until the next day. So he was probably quite canny, thinking that that was somewhere that he was going to go. And the fact that he would be able to watch as people dispersed and left would have made it very simple for him to have known when it was safe to strike. And after a wedding, you know how it is. Everyone goes home a little bit tipsy or worse, and everything gets left exactly as it is until people start clearing up. So as the reception comes to an end and he sees the bride and groom leave, the guests kind of disperse to various smaller parties. In fact, Mr. and Mrs. Leitner and their son Richard goes to Basil Leitner's brother's house. It's about a mile away. But Nicola, she's 18, she's had enough of the party, she's enjoying being in a bridesmaid's dress, and she just stays home. She plays records in her bedroom, and she's actually got a balcony, and she has her doors open, and she's just dancing. She's 18. She's wearing her bridesmaid's dress. You know, she's been a princess for the day, isn't she? And she's completely unaware of what's going to happen next. You know, there she is just enjoying, dancing, wearing her gorgeous bridesmaid dress, celebrating the day that she's probably just really enjoyed. And just outside is this deviant sexual predator just waiting to pounce. So Hutchinson has now decided that he's going to attack that home. He's watched all of this play out, all the wedding play out from his hiding place. He's been planning his next moves. And just a couple of hours after the party's finished, he goes in the house. We know that the Leitners were not there for a while. They actually get back around midnight and they go to bed pretty much straight away. The master bedroom's on the ground floor at the front of the house, and from there there's a staircase up to 3 more bedrooms, and Nicola's room is on the first floor. Richard's bedroom was on the first floor above that of his parents, but his room was across the landing from where Nicola was. When they all go to sleep, that's when Arthur Hutchinson strikes. And it is one of the most violent scenes that I've ever come across. So the killings begin with Richard Leitner. You know, he's 28 years old. He wants to be a doctor. He's got big dreams. He's attacked completely unprovoked in his bedroom. He was stabbed repeatedly in the chest and neck, and they found him half on and half off his bed. I mean, The stabbing was repeated and aggressive, and there was absolutely no way that Arthur Hutchinson wanted him alive. No one could survive the injuries that he experienced. Because of the struggle that's going on, Basil Leitner gets up to investigate, and he is attacked right at the top of the stairs. He was stabbed 3 times, and then his body fell down the stairs. But the worst attack regarding murders was what happened to Avril Leitner. She was stabbed 26 times. 26 times in a downstairs bedroom. Now, she struggled. Her injuries had lots of defence wounds to the palms of her hands, and her fingers were so badly attacked in trying to defend herself that they were cut straight to the bone. And it shows you that every single murder that he carried out just seemed to escalate in rage. And also note that it was the woman who was given the most aggression. What does that say about the comfort that he had abusing women? There's something about that, isn't there? That he was absolutely violently aggressive in this particular murder. It's called overkill. You know, when somebody stabs somebody and then stabs somebody again and then literally just stabs them constantly. It says something about rage or enjoyment, just wanting to absolutely desecrate the form that was once human. And this isn't enough for him. In fact, I do wonder whether the reason that all those deaths occurred was simply for this next action. He goes upstairs and he turns his attentions towards the younger daughter, Nicola. She's 18, remember. Basically has a torch, shoves it in her face, gets her up and says that if she screams or does anything, he's going to kill her. And believe me, she had evidence, you know. She had evidence. He's covered in blood. She doesn't know at this point that her family's dead, but she does know that a guy is covered in blood and he's threatening her and he's got a weapon. He then rapes her. So after all of this horrific stuff that he's just done, what's on his mind is sexually deviant behaviour. He's turned on by what's happened. He's enjoyed it. It's actually stimulated him. So he rapes this young kid at knife point and then he walks her downstairs. So on the way down, she has to walk past the body of her father. She has to walk through a pool of his blood. That blood's found dried all over her feet when they actually do discover her. Once she gets into the marquee, he handcuffs her to a chair, he rapes her again, and then he just boasts and brags about how he killed everyone in the house. He blindfolds her, and then she even has to listen to him eating and drinking the leftover food. I mean, what kind of a human does that? He's just murdered in the most brutal way 3 members of her beloved family. And now he's bragging about it and eating the food and drink that they paid for. And what does that tell you? What does that say about his character? Now she's taken back upstairs again, raped for a 3rd time. Can you believe that? And then again, as dawn breaks, he brings her back, binds her, and tells her to take care. Can you believe that? Her foot's caked in her father's blood. He's bound and gagged her. He's raped her repeatedly, several times. Her nightdress is stained with her mother's blood from Hutchinson's blood-stained hands. No one knows why he chose to leave the girl alive. It's never been revealed by him. He's never explained why. It could be that he was delusional in the context that he thought that she actually wanted it and enjoyed it. It wouldn't surprise me. Men like him don't really think about the way that they make somebody else feel, they think about how they feel. So if she hadn't put up too much resistance, if she hadn't complained too much, if she hadn't tried to resist, there is a chance that he probably would have imagined that because he enjoyed it, she did. That's how outside the realms of reality he is. Imagine what it was like for those workmen who came. Just walking in. Average job, yeah? Taking down this huge marquee, and then what they find is this horrifically traumatised, badly injured 18-year-old girl. And that's just the beginning. So immediately a murder investigation's launched because they find the horrible scene of the slaughtered, massacred family. The most crucial evidence that's got to come is from Nicola. But remember, she has just suffered the most traumatic experience of her life. Rape is incredibly traumatizing. Repeated rape and hostage situations add to that, which is what she's been through. But then her parents and her brother are dead. She's seen it. She's covered in the blood. How does anybody even begin to formulate a sentence after that? So for a few days, she can't talk at all. She's in complete psychological collapse. I imagine they will have sedated her just to try to make her get through those initial time. But after 3 days, she is able to provide information, and she gives a description to the killer. They take a sketch of him, and obviously she's able to talk through what had happened, how it had began. One of the things we know about the attack that initially happened on Nicola was that he was like knelt on her to kind of make her powerless, and that had caused that wound in his knee to break open, and it bled through the bandages onto the sheets. So we instantly had some forensics there. The police were able to match the blood group of that patch of blood with that of Hutchinson's. There wasn't DNA at this time, so that blood itself could be used to prove that Hutchinson was present. The sketch that she did was a good one. You know, it showed a guy with thin features, curly hair, slightly bent nose. So they knew that they were looking for a guy who fitted this kind of Weasley image. I'll put some images of him in. He is a Weasley looking man. You know, he's one of those people that you do think looks a little bit like a wrong-un, and he definitely comes across that way. But they were able, as the police went through the search, to find so much forensic evidence at the scene. You know, there's a blood stain on one of Nicola's bed sheets that had come from him. When he raped Nicola, there was also semen. There were so many indicators that the killer hadn't really considered the forensic scenario. But again, I don't know whether that's because he genuinely thinks he can just get away with everything, or then maybe he just knows that his time's up nearly and he's going to enjoy the last bit of opportunity for freedom he has. He even takes a bite from one of the cheese, and he drank from a bottle of champagne. So they're able to collect blood from a palm print from the champagne bottle, and also a perfectly effective dental impression from the piece of cheese. Now that's important because that forensic evidence is how you secure a conviction. But before they can secure a conviction, they need to find the suspect. What's fantastic at this point is that a colleague from North Yorkshire Police realises that the sketch that Nicola has managed to create has a likeness for their recently escaped prisoner, Arthur Hutchinson. Now that's so important because suddenly you've got this police officer at another constabulary recognising that there is a deep likeness, and also it's his MO, serious sexual assault. Okay, murder hasn't happened before, but he's attempted it. He's definitely got the streak within him that would give you an insight to the potential for these kind of crimes. So they compare the palm prints from the champagne bottle to the fingerprints, because at this point, constabularies aren't connected. A crime in one place can go unnoticed by a crime in another when the person's the same who's done it. So this is where we find that because they're comparing those notes, there's an exact match. They now know that they are looking for Arthur Hutchinson. He's still free, but now the hunt's on. What blows my mind about this particular arrogant killer is that he courted the limelight. This is also to know around the time of the Yorkshire Ripper. So he actually caused quite a few problems for the police forces because it became confusing as to who they were looking for, because they were looking obviously for the Yorkshire Ripper, but now this Fox guy has suddenly appeared, and because this investigation was being done at the same time in tandem, the messages that the Fox starts to leave for the Yorkshire Post, because he's so arrogant and wants everyone to know who he is and what he's done, he basically starts to interfere to some degree and hamper the impact of the investigation on the Yorkshire Ripper. So Hutchinson starts getting in contact with radio stations and newspapers to kind of brag about the fact that he's free. Again, an insight into his complete lack of morals, his complete lack of boundaries, and his need to be noticed, his need to be seen. And we see this, it's common. It's common that people who kill like this, they want to be famous. They want to be visible. They can't help themselves. They write to the newspapers, or they call radio stations, or they put little pieces of information that essentially lead the police and the media to be aware of who they are to some degree. And undoubtedly, Arthur Hutchinson wanted people to know that he had escaped and he was still at large. And I imagine part of that would have been the power he got from it, you know, to terrify a whole area. And he did. People in this area did not go out. They were vigilant because they knew that at any point this kind of thing could happen to them. This man was acutely dangerous, and the police knew that unless they caught him quickly, there was a strong likelihood he was going to strike again. One of the things that we see in the police inquiry is that they start using the media. They talk about the injury that he suffered to his leg, and they actually did this in a way that was really effective. They started to put out information where they were saying they were concerned that the kind of injury that he'd suffered could lead to him losing his leg, to try to incite him to go and get hospital treatment. But they also started to work with different police forces. So they started working together. And that was really important because, as I said, until now, this is really one of the most pivotal cases. Constabularies tended to work by themselves, but this collaboration meant that they started to involve Hutchinson's family. So they were able to speak to Arthur Hutchinson's mother, and even though she found it almost impossible to believe, they helped to convince her that he was a danger to the public and he did need help. So the police forces work together and they create this message that suggests that she isn't well. I mean, she wasn't well, to be honest. She wasn't well at that point. But they felt that the relationship between Arthur Hutchinson and his mother was so strong that he would try to contact her. And it worked. Because with his mother's consent, the police were able to listen into the telephone conversations when he did make contact, and they knew that he was using a phone box close to her address. And she was even filmed being taken from her house on a stretcher and put in an ambulance, and that was put out on the local news. It was to solidify that scenario. It was to make Arthur Hutchinson believe that his mother really was ill, to provoke that contact. Isn't it strange that this monstrous murderer was moved in that way? It always surprises me that with such a lack of humanity, somebody can still have that thread of compassion running through them, totally drowned out by all the dark behaviour, but still just that thread that seems to run through Arthur Hutchinson when it comes down to his mother not being well. Now, because they knew that he was around his mother's address, they bring in the big guns. They have police dogs and the handlers are there. Lots of the task force really well trained in searching open ground and wooded areas because they assume that that's where he's sleeping rough. And one of the police officers was actually a pilot. So he had his private pilot license. So he hires a light aircraft and flies over the area. Now you have to remember that this is actually before they used police helicopters. So this is really quite modern. You know, this investigation took policing to a whole new degree. They were working together effectively, and they were using things like light aircraft so that they could properly scope out the area. And they found him because of that. He was spotted in a part of open land. There was loads of woodland around it, and it meant that the dog handlers could move in. He was arrested literally about a mile away from his mother's home. He's taken to the local police station. He's obviously detained because he's charged with lots of different offences, including that of the murder of the Leitner family, and of course the horrific assault and rape on that poor girl, Nicola, after him escaping from Selby. That was the carnage that occurred. You've got to think like that. If he had never got out of that place, if he'd never had his handcuffs taken off him, all those people would still be alive. They would have had a wonderful wedding and got on with their world. There was so much evidence, absolutely loads of evidence from the killings of the Leitners. It was obvious that he was the one responsible for the murders, and clearly the fact that Nicola Leitner had almost given an identical looking proof of an artist's copy that looked just like him made it even more compelling. And Nicola and the artist who drew him did such an amazing job that, as I said, it was a thing that provoked and created the opportunity of that collaboration by the police forces. And it's really rare that police forces issue wanted notices. They really don't do it very often, because the problem with doing that is that can mean a jury who may have seen those notices can feel swayed. Because obviously you cannot sway any jury. You have to make sure that the person who's given a trial, even people like Arthur Hutchinson, receive a fair trial. It's the same reason why you can't bring in past offences. Because if you tell me that somebody's raped somebody before and they're up for rape, I'm going to find them guilty. I'm just going to have a bias. They've done it before, it's them, right? So they really worried about the impact, but this was so important, he was so dangerous, that they actually did that. In fact, the escape was such a spectacular and exceptional circumstance that one of the things that they did when he escaped was to have a public announcement the same night, because they wanted to get it on the BBC News. They wanted this man apprehended. So they really did try to prevent Arthur Hutchinson committing these crimes. And they did expect a really good response, but the number of calls that came in were basically so enormous that they actually cited it as a major disaster. They opened a casualty bureau and they made use of every single officer that they had spare to handle all the calls. And there were 3,000 calls and almost 1,000 calls a day during the first week of the investigation. That's how responsive the public were. You know, they were terrified. When the case went to court, as you could imagine, Arthur Hutchinson was not going to go down without fighting. On Monday the 7th of November 1983, he's remanded in custody, but his defence lawyers decided to apply to the Sheffield court for the case to be held away from Sheffield, because they felt that Mr. Leitner's law practice, remember Mr. Leitner, one of the victims, had this big city law department, and they felt that that might prejudice some of the jury and also the actual court itself. So instead they managed to get it transferred to Durham, and at this point Arthur Hutchinson pleads not guilty to all the charges. Remember the forensic evidence, remember the actual witness who's alive, remember these very clear indicators, but no, he says he's not guilty on any grounds, denies being at the house, keeps changing his story though, because the forensic evidence is massive, so he realises that that story is probably not going to wash and might look bad to a jury. So instead, he decides to just kind of tell them this really tall tale around why he's at the house. Another thing to add is he's got a really rare blood group, and it's unique to only 1 in 50,000 people. So we can show that there's an exact match for Hutchinson's blood, and it's been found all over Nicola's bedsheets. And they also had a forensic orthodontist, you know, an expert in teeth, who was like, you know your teeth, Arthur Hutchinson? Yeah, matches perfectly the massive bite that you took from the cheese. Not your best day for trying to cover a crime. So they absolutely compounded the fact that Arthur Hutchinson was in the wedding marquee. They were exact, the bite marks, absolutely exact. And then of course you have the palm prints on the bottle of champagne. So he has to think on his feet. And by the way, at this point, he's referring to himself as the Fox. Yeah, he gave himself that name. And he likes the name because he thinks he's cunning and sly. I mean, he is cunning and sly, but he's also stupid and very dangerous. And that mix in itself tends to catch people out in the end. So he has to really think about this. How do I place myself at the scene, but still not actually be guilty of murder? So he's like, he concedes, okay, yeah, I was in the house. I'd been invited the night before by Nicola. Remember Nicola? The girl they find tied up, blindfolded, and pretty much without clothing after sustaining a horrific, repeated rape situation. Yeah, apparently they met at a pub the night before. She invites him back and he goes. They have a great time, you know. She leaves the patio door open for him. He finds a bottle of champagne, you know, may as well go and enjoy this celebration together now that she's got the place to herself. They had consensual sexual intercourse and he left after having this amazing night. And then someone else must have come in and killed the rest of the family because he didn't. I mean, that's the story that he concocts. But remember, even though it might seem laughable looking in from the outside, you know, you can see that it's going nowhere. He's going to get found guilty. But this does something really, really challenging. It means that Nicola has to be cross-examined. If he goes not guilty, then it's the job of the prosecution to ensure that the witnesses make it so that he goes to jail. And Nicola, the person he has raped violently, the daughter of this wonderful family who she's seen brutally murdered, whose blood caked her own feet, was forced to be cross-examined by the defence counsel. And let me tell you, a cross-examination in court is horrible. They are clever people and they are there to pick holes in your account. And even if you have a resilient nature and you haven't been through something traumatic, even if you're just being pulled in as a witness that it hasn't necessarily affected you, but you've been witness to something, it can be absolutely psychologically terrifying. But you know what? He picked the wrong girl because she was absolutely unshakable, unmovable. She knew exactly what had happened. She couldn't be intimidated by the defence, and she was really sincere. Yes, she was upset. Yes, she couldn't stand the fact that she had to be in a court with that man. But she made it very clear that every claim that he came up with was absolute lies. She didn't invite him to the house. She certainly didn't leave the patio door open for him. And without doubt, she did not consent to sex with him. In fact, one of the things that came out in the court is that she pretended to Hutchinson that she enjoyed the sex. That probably saved her life. Because if she had resisted, it would have affected his ego. And we know that he kills without worry. We know that he already has massacred her entire family on probably one of the happiest days of their lives. And she stands in that court and makes damn sure that he knows that he hasn't got power any longer. The fact that she was able to act as though the sex was enjoyable will have convinced this ego, this arrogant criminal, that she did enjoy it. Remember, that's about his ego. He's done this awful brutality, he's murdered her entire family. But because she's seemingly enjoying what he's doing to her, that means that he believes, remember, he's always been a ladies' man, that this is just exactly what he'd expect. You know, he was so good that in spite of all of the horrible stuff he'd done, you know, it was forgivable because she was enjoying it. I'm so glad that she acted in that way. That must have taken every ounce of her strength. One of the things that Nicola also said was that he actually put on a Scottish accent throughout it all. So he was trying to disguise himself to some degree. I'm so glad that she was able to stand there strongly, because in that moment she took every bit of power away from him. And again, it shows you that he really, really was unaware that other people had their own personalities, their own subjective experience. You know, he's not seeing people as people, he's seeing them as objects to be used, and he's missing the important nuance that that witness that he leaves alive, even though she's gone through this horrendous trauma, she has been seeping in every bit of ammunition so that she can basically blow him up when she's given the option, and blow him up she does. It becomes even more ludicrous during that court case because obviously the papers are reporting, we know that they do that now, and there's a guy called Mike Barron who's a Sunday Mirror reporter, and he's been one of those who's been kind of in the court looking at what's happening, getting things out in the papers. And yeah, Arthur Hutchinson's like, what do I do now? What do I do now? All my case has been broken down and everyone knows I'm guilty. I'll just point at Mike Barron and say, actually, that's your killer there. You know? But yeah, apparently Mike Barron, this Sunday reporter, just turned up at the wedding, you know, afterwards, and went to attack Arthur Hutchinson. And so the reason his bloody handprints were on the champagne bottle was because he was using it as a weapon to defend himself against Mr. Barron. I mean, at this point, we are in some kind of bizarre universe with Arthur Hutchinson. I mean, he's clearly not functioning from, shall we say, a normal, typical place and position. I think what's really important about this case as well is that this is really what starts cross-referencing information, and that changed everything. The cost of the operation back in the day, and that's a lot of money that I'm going to talk about, is 200 grand, £200,000 it took to actually get him investigated and convicted. I mean, worth every penny, but it shows you that this was when something was ignited within the police forces. They suddenly realised this is a way to get investigations more fairly and accurately dealt with. And it really was the beginning of systems that we see today, where you can cross-reference if an offender is in one area or if a domestic abuser is in another area, and so on and so forth. And even though computers were really just beginning, this made such an impact. He was convicted, and rightfully so. The judge was Mr. Justice Caulfield, and he described Fairley as a decadent advertisement for evil pornographers. They are harsh words. A decadent advertisement for evil pornographers. That's how brutal the murders were. That people who wish to consume that kind of information, that's the kind of case that they look for, because it's so grotesque. It's so disgusting, so immoral. One of the things I mentioned earlier was that the police discovered a cassette tape in a Darlington guest house that he stayed at. It's one of several places that he stayed at. And he signed himself in the guest book under the name A. Fox. It says it all really, doesn't it? A fox. And there are extracts of these tapes, and they've been published in the media. And he absolutely demonstrated willful arrogance in the recordings. I'll share a little bit of this with you now. And basically, he was recorded as saying, because I was able to get this tape recorder, transistor, I've been able to listen to everything that's been going on, where they've been waiting for me, where they've been looking for me. So I knew exactly which way to head out of them. Like playing cat and mouse, or should I say, fox on the trot. I'm making no comments on the Trouble killings. Let the police do what they want. I'm saying nout. I'm not telling anybody nothing about that business. Maybe I'm a bit daft in the head. like people think I am. Let them think what they want. I'm still free. That's the main fucking thing. Now, a real victory after his conviction is that the then Home Secretary Leon Britton, who became Lord Britton, he actually decided that the crime was so heinous that there was no way he was accepting that 18-year sentence. And in fact, he extended it to a whole life tariff. There are really very few of those in the UK. A lot in America, but in the UK, you don't tend to get a life sentence that means life. But he was considered so dangerous that this was upheld. Now, he has consistently challenged this decision. He's made lots of appeals against it. In 2008, he'd served the minimum term imposed, and he went to the High Court and challenged the whole life term, and they reviewed it and said, you know what? It's a no. It's a no. All three judges were like, you do not deserve to walk the streets. You are a dangerous person. Life will mean life. In fact, all the judges said that in their career it was the most heinous crimes they'd ever dealt with. And in 2013, again, is in the British news. He's challenging the sentence because the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights in July that year ruled that whole life tariffs were a breach of human rights. So it was talking about a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's all about you can't treat somebody inhumanly and you have to give people a fair option. And so he was there straight away saying that it was inhuman and it was degrading because he's got no hope of relief. As of me telling you this story, you know, he spent over 30 years behind bars. He's 75 years old now, and he is definitely going to, in my opinion, die in prison. And I don't even care if he is safe now. I don't care. This man deserves to die in prison without a doubt. Whenever you think about the type of crimes that he committed throughout his whole life, from 7 years of age, he became a danger. Why would we imagine that even in his 70s or 80s, that he would be anything other? The thing is as well, if he is successful at some point in challenging his life tariff, that would actually give a lot of people other options to do the same. So those who are in for these kind of crimes and those that are seen to be too dangerous to walk the streets would be seen as a gateway for them to start opening the door to that opportunity. And that is terrifying. One of the reasons that I've covered this case is because the surviving members of that particular massacre, they've moved away and they've got new identities. The reason for that is they didn't want to be in the media spotlight. And for me, that makes it easier because this is one of those cases that I wanted to cover in detail, but I didn't really want to have any connection to that family because it just feels like it's so macabre and disgusting and diabolical that you know that the family would be probably triggered by this experience, but they do have new identities and they are not in the public arena at all now. However, you cannot escape the fact that whenever Hutchinson is mentioned in the press, whenever he's talking about appealing, you absolutely know that wherever they are and whatever they're doing, they are just going to relive that nightmare because they're going to have that constant fear that just one day his human rights are going to have more meaning than their human rights. And that's terrifying. One of the surviving Leitner family said, whenever even the name Arthur Hutchinson rears its ugly head, it does nothing but create fear and cause distress to the victims of his heinous crime. Let the human rights judiciary members be thrust into our position for just a day, and maybe they would understand this. And that was a spokesman for the surviving Leitner family members, and they are really powerful words. And I think they're the words that I will leave you with this week, because we must remember that within every crime, there is a victim. And in crimes like these, it brings into sharp focus that you can be going about your ordinary business, that you can be living a completely ordinary life, celebrating ordinary events, and something as tragic, terrifying, and destructive of this can befall you. Fortunately now, the fox is well and truly trapped. And let's hope the next time he's let out of prison, he'll be in a box. I hope you found this case interesting. Like I said, I don't think it's talked about a great deal. It's terrifying. It's a reminder to us that we always have to take absolute care and be vigilant with our health and well-being, because whilst these kind of crimes are rare, they do happen. And simple things like making absolutely sure that your doors are locked can make a difference. They really can. I hope you will subscribe, because I love my subscribers. It means you'll get updated every single Sunday, and then you can catch up with another crime or cult or whatever I'm covering then. Remember as well, I have an app out called Appy. It's Appy Wellbeing. You can get it on the Google Play and the App Store. It's completely free. It covers health, nutrition, well-being, and physical fitness. And why wouldn't you? Have the app. It's completely free, and it might improve your life. See you next week for another True Crime with Emma Kenny, or Kenny's Crime Cult. Whichever one you're going to go for. Join me. See you then.